When you play the Game of Thrones, you
Subscribe and like.
or you die. There is no middle ground.
Alright, hello YouTube, welcome back to the Grease Commons YouTube channel. Today's video, we are going to be doing part 3 of kind of my book reviews, or talking about why I think each book, A Song of Ice and Fire series, could be your favorite. Now, I've already done Game of Thrones and A Clash of Kings, so I'd highly recommend you watching those videos before you watch this one, just because it makes sense narratively. But in this book, we're going to talk about where all the characters go and kind of the main themes and what makes this book so great. But before we get into the video, if you guys like to like, subscribe, and comment, please do. It helps the channel grow, reach our appeal, and might like this content as well. And let's get into the video. So starting in this video, I want to talk about a couple of the main themes with this book and what makes this book so compelling and good, and how it is kind of the ending of the first half of the story, right? Where I kind of view this book as containing the climax. I think the climax so far of the entire story and how I feel like it's going to play out is going to be kind of the red wedding, purple wedding, that kind of portion of the book. So that to me is the climax, because we see how every event happens after that, right? We have this kind of next period in the A Song of Ice and Fire books where we've been at war and leading up to war the entire time, and then about midway through Storm of Swords, we start to go back down to where it's kind of peacetime, but we're having problems in peacetime, and kind of setting up the next few books and letting the plotters, kind of like the Greyjoys, the Martells, getting all these other new characters in Feast, when we'll talk about that later on, and allowing new players to kind of gain power with the peacetime now. But I also wanted to say that this is your guys's more or less your favorite book. I did a poll, and I think this book was about 58, maybe 53%, somewhere around there. The last time I checked the poll that I put up maybe a month ago at this point, maybe, asking you guys what your favorite book was, or what was the best book, and you guys said it was this one. So, yeah. Now, for me, this is my second favorite book, but if I'm looking at it objectively, taking out biases for who my favorite characters are and stuff like that, I objectively do believe this is the best book. Now, let's kind of talk about it. Now, there are a lot of themes in this book, right? It's the kind of conclusion of the arcs of, I feel like, the first 3 books, because a lot of the characters go in different routes after this book. But if you talk about the big one is, for me, there's always this reference made to how heavy the crown is. And this even continues on in the next 2 books, but Robb constantly, Caitlyn notes this quite a bit, is that the crown seems heavy, and it feels as though a lot of the decisions of kings or queens come to a head in this book. Robb's many decisions lead to the Red Wedding. Joffrey being just an absolute idiot and just vicious dude leads the Tyrells to want to kill him because, you know, they don't want Marjorie to marry this dude, of course. Like, you know, things like that. If we even look at, you know, characters making bad decisions and those kind of creeping up on them, Tyrion and Tywin, you can also kind of put in that one as well, where Tyrion, I talk about this a lot when I talk about Tyrion's character, is that Tyrion is someone that plays into the imp role quite a bit, right? He kind of acts the way people almost believe him to act. He almost plays that role. So when we get to the trial in this book, which again is one of the best chapters of the book, where you have, I think there's about 2 chapters where it's Tyrion's trial, where you have the beginning of his trial and the trial by combat chapter, which I did a review on last week. But Tyrion is kind of condemned by all of these people because of the way he acts and the kind of portrayal that he does. And that's something that's huge. And Tywin, again, is another big thing here, is Tywin is this master player of the game, but his one bad decision, the one thing he's always done wrong, is his mistreatment of Tyrion, and that ends up leading to Tyrion killing him. So you see a lot of things come to a head in this book, where I definitely consider this book to be the conclusions to a lot of stories. Like I've said, it's where we see a lot of payoffs, where things in book 1 have been foreshadowed into book 3. And Caitlyn, I think, is a major character in the first half of this book, where she is constantly giving us foreshadowing of what is to come in this book, and giving us foreshadowing about the Red Wedding, like how she has so much unease. I've done a chapter review of Catelyn's chapter right before the Red Wedding, and it is amazing how much foreshadowing George is able to fit in there, but almost subtly. It's where you have to be paying attention, and there's just so many great chapters in this book. If you look at a lot of my chapter reviews, most of my chapter reviews are of this book because they have so many big high moments in this book, and that's what I think makes it so beloved for most people in the kind of fandom. And when you kind of go even deeper, right? You know, I'm going to talk about most POVs in this book as well in this video, but when you look at the ideas that are provided in this book, where there are a lot of characters that are struggling with love, a lot of characters that are struggling with loneliness, and we see that principally with Tyrion. Tyrion is someone that is married. He is someone kind of in a relationship with Shay as well, and we see when we get to the Purple Wedding, I've done an analysis on this chapter as well, but Tyrion's entire chapter is kind of based upon how lonely and isolated he feels, where he just wants someone to love him for him, right? Everything that Tysha gave him is what he wants, even though he believes that that's a lie, that she was a whore. We see into Tyrion's mind how horrible it is when he really has like no one, and how Sansa will never treat him the way he kind of wants to be treated. And that is a very common theme with Tyrion's character throughout all of the books. And something I always talk about when we get into Dance of the Dragons, I'll talk about this even more, is how Tyrion, when he does find out that Tysha did love him, and she wasn't, you know, this prostitute or anything like that, it breaks him. And it's something that the show just completely whiffed and missed. Right? It's the reason Tyrion acts the way he does in the next book, alongside of, you know, everything that just went on with him killing Shay and killing his father and losing the trust of one of the only people he really trusted in Jaime. It all plays into his character in the next book. And the show doing away with the Tysha stuff, it made his character very bland. So that's a big thing I wanted to talk about. And that even goes to Jon, you know, and Jon and Ygritte. Their romance is very heavy in this book. And we see how Jon falls for Ygritte, right? You know, he's taken this vow, but sometimes love is the death of duty and honor and stuff like that. And in this case, it isn't, because even though Jon is in love and he loves Ygritte, he still does his duty. So this is one of the few times where we see that love does not prevail over duty, where Jon decides to, you know, stay true to his brothers. And that decision ends up costing him, right? If he had been in love with Ygritte and they had run away, this would have been completely different. Maybe the outcome would have been different, but we see that how things end up happening is the wildlings ending up attacking the wall in Castle Black, and Ygritte is killed. So it shows you kind of the reverse of that, where when you do choose duty and honor over love, those people die. And that's something that we even see with Robb in this book with Jon as well, where Jon, back in book 1, had chose to stay at the Night's Watch and do his duty and all that above love. And what ended up happening, right? Where Robb dies, Ned dies. So we see where love is the duty of honor, but we also see the flip side of that, where honor is kind of the death of love, where those people of your loved ones end up losing their lives. So that is a big idea in this book as well. We see that over kind of a lot of different areas. Robb as well with Jane Westerling, where he does the opposite, where he chooses love. Well, not even exactly love. I do believe he came to kind of love Jane, but the reason he does duty, but he does the wrong duty. He should have stayed faithful to the phrase, but he instead decides to marry Jane because he sleeps with her, which again we'll talk about in Feast, because there's a lot more going on with that. And I do think there was a setup kind of with Jane being the one to heal Robb's wounds. I think that was definitely a setup, but we're not going to talk about it in this video. Now, those are some of the bigger themes going on in this book, and we see that Daenerys as well. This to me is when Daenerys starts to get good. For the first 2 books, I'm not the biggest fan of Daenerys. I think book 1, I really like when she starts to come into her Khaleesi role, and we see her kind of in a position of power and stuff like that, and where she's starting to gain confidence. I really like her in book 1 at that point of it. And I would say maybe the back half of book 1, I really like Daenerys. And book 2, she just feels like she's wandering around, like, where she doesn't even really need to be in the story, right? Where you could just do a quick cut from the end of book 1 to book 3 and just say, oh, well, she got a ship or something, and yeah, they go to Astapor, all that. But book 3, Dany definitely starts to really get going, and this is what I thought was really interesting when I had first read the books, is I did not realize how kind of smart Daenerys is and how she manipulates people, how she kind of comes up with her way of taking Yunkai. I've done a whole video on that as well, but the way she plays the innocent role, like she's very young, she doesn't know anything, and she uses that against people. She's very smart in this book when it comes to conquering. And a very common theme for Daenerys is, one, she's a very good conqueror, but she's a very bad ruler. And that is very much kind of established here, because what I think George does really, really, really well is he shows us how good Daenerys is at conquering, but then in the next book, so Dance with Dragons for Daenerys, we see the opposite. We see her struggling to rule. We see her struggling to kind of corral in Meereen and even try to keep some semblance of peace in Slaver's Bay, and it all starts to kind of blow up in her face. And I think from this point on, I really don't have a lot of complaints with Daenerys. I think as soon as book 3 happens, she becomes a vastly more interesting character, especially in book 5. I know a lot of people don't like Daenerys as much in book 5, but I like seeing Daenerys' struggles in book 5. I like seeing her kind of have this test run of what it would kind of be like to try and rule. Now, something that I think Daenerys kind of overlooks, and Barristan definitely hints at, is that Meereen is something that is very much different than how it would be to rule Westeros, because they're just two very different cultures. And if you're taking over Westeros, you're really not uplifting a culture. You're just kind of taking the throne by force, and that's all that's going to happen. You know, you have your normal plotters and all that stuff, but Meereen, Dany's uplifting an entire culture, an entire history, something very different. We see that in our own today's world, where we see that whenever you're trying to bring in a new kind of culture and trying to get rid of the old one, people don't like that, and you will have a lot of resistance to that. We see that with kind of I'll use American references since I am American. When the colonists did come over and their treatment of Native Americans, how that it's not the same, because Dany is doing a good thing where she's taking away slavery, but it's the same type of concept where you're kind of forcing a different type of culture on people that have lived in a culture their entire lives. It's just something that's very difficult to do, whether it's good or bad. Now, looking at Daenerys again, I think this is her best book by far. I have really not a lot of problems with Daenerys in this book. I think this is definitely her best book. Now, talking about Arya, I want to talk about Arya as well in this book, because Arya, this is where I think her kind of character comes to this road, right? Where Arya, by the end of this book, has to make a decision. Does she want to try and go north to maybe Jon? Does she try and go back to the north? Or does she go to Braavos? And originally, her plan was going to be, yes, she's going to go north, but eventually that doesn't really work out, and she ends up going to Braavos instead, as we'll talk about in Feast. But we look at all the decisions leading up and all the things that happen in Arya's life in this book before that, where Arya, it seems like most of this book, she's trying to get back to her mother and her brother and her family, something that's kind of been going on since the end of book 1, and we see it. She's getting so close. She's right there. She's right next to the twins, and Arya feels inside like they're never going to make it, and that they're still so far away, and she just can't believe it. And from everything she's seen so far in these 2 books that have kind of hardened her, right, where she's seen the horrors of war, she's seen the just terrible things that go on in the world and how people will treat each other, she's not willing to believe that she can find happiness in her life again and go back to having a family, because she's struggled with trying to make other people, like social friends and stuff like that, that will stay with her, right? If Gendry ends up leaving her, Hot Pie ends up leaving her, all these people she considers friends leave her. or betray her in some way. And she finally gets there. She gets to the Freys, or the twins, I guess, and we have the Red Wedding. It continues to show Arya why she should feel this feeling of revenge, spite, just kind of a negative feeling. She's very much someone that, a pessimistic, I think, is a good thing to describe Arya after this point, where she really believes that everywhere she goes, bad happens to the people that she cares about. And she decides to go to Bravos to try to become a faceless man. And that's really Arya's kind of arc in this book, where another key thing with her character is, with all the qualities I'm saying, they're only amplified because of her time with the Hound as well. Someone who will amplify all of the qualities I just mentioned that Arya starts to gain in this book and takes a very darker kind of route, only amplified by her time with the Hound, and also even her time with the Brotherhood Without Banners, just based upon how they're willing to sell Arya, how they're only really looking out for themselves. They're not these loyal and Stark men and all that. And it's just more that feeds Arya's fire, that the world is just kind of against her, and the world is a very cruel place, and kind of her maturing and growing up. And something I've always talked about, and something that I mentioned really in the first video we did, is that Arya and Sansa are very different in that way. Is that Sansa is the one that is kind of all caught up in the songs, and she's very girly, she's ladylike. Arya is very much the survivalist. She's the one that's more practical. She can survive. She thinks about things in a way of self-preservation that Sansa never would, and we see that definitely in this book, and especially I would say the last book as well. But Arya, something that is really weird to me that I never really thought about is that, or I guess maybe not thought about, but something that I never realized is that Arya gets the most chapters in this book. Arya's definitely, outside of like a character like Tyrion, is the kind of the main character of this book. So it's interesting when you look at it from that point of view. Now, I mentioned Tyrion, let's might as well get into Tyrion. I think this is really Tyrion's book. As I've said, I think it's tough because I think both book 2 and book 3 can be considered Tyrion books. They are both fantastic in his POVs. Tyrion continues again in King's Landing, and we see that Tyrion has lost all of his power at the beginning of this book, and kind of in the end of the last book as well. But he has kind of lost his power, and he's trying to regain, find some sort of respect, find anything, anyone trying to treat him better, as after he just kind of saved the entire city, and he's gonna get no credit for it. And we hear this multiple times that Tyrion really gets no credit for the battle at King's Landing with Stannis, the Battle of the Blackwater. He gets no credit. Everything goes to Tywin and the Tyrells, but nothing will go to him, even though if he wasn't there, the city would have been sacked by the time they even got there. So Tyrion deals with that and trying to gain power back, and trying to find any real semblance of happiness, continue on with the Shay plotline with Tyrion. And Tyrion, it just feels like, gets beat down at every turn in this book, right? Whereas Robb and all of that, Robb is definitely making bad decision after bad decision. Tyrion is just having kind of the same way, but in a different light. Whereas Robb is actively kind of making bad decisions with his help of his mother, Caitlyn, Tyrion isn't really making bad decisions, but he has no power in a lot of the positions he's in. So Joffrey's constantly up his ass, Tywin's up his ass, and then Tyrion getting forced to marry Sansa, something that Tyrion desperately doesn't want. It's very uncomfortable, their relationship. Sansa kind of just hates Tyrion, and it's something that Tyrion doesn't want, because Tyrion continues to feel lonely, and with him being, married to a woman that does not like him at all, it basically condemns him to a life of just no happiness. And we see as the Purple Wedding comes, he's falsely accused, and everyone turns on him. Tyrion very much is alone in this book. He doesn't really have anyone, even his, his squire that saves his life, Pod. He has to leave the city. It's a rough book for Tyrion. And it all kind of comes to a head in the second trial chapter for Tyrion, where he just finally has enough of people. He just has enough of people's shit, and he's like, no, I've been on trial my whole life for being a dwarf. I've been judged by people based upon what I look like for so long. I'm just tired of it. And he has Oberyn fight for him and all that stuff. And it even looks up for Tyrion, right? You're sitting here going, Tyrion's one of the main characters. We've already had the Red Wedding, the Purple Wedding. How much crazier are we going to get? Oberyn dies. He was kind of a fan favorite character, a very intriguing character that we would have loved to have seen more of. He dies. It looks like Tyrion might die. Then Jaime. It's a roller coaster. The last 500 pages, so the back half of this book, there's almost no breaks. You are constantly getting huge payoffs. You're learning huge amounts of information, and that's where this book is. And Littlefinger, again, playing his game while he's not even in the city. Getting Sansa out and also killing Joffrey, 2 major wins for Littlefinger. And it's just amazing the way that this book is paid off and set up from the last 2 books, and it all comes to kind of a head. And talking about Sansa, she is in a mentally dark place as well, right? Where I would say a lot of the characters in this book just have a decline in mental health. Like, Sansa is already being basically tortured and is in a very bad place. Now, she finds a little bit of joy when she is, not having to marry Joffrey anymore, right? She thinks the torment's over. And again, she kind of is thinking too much on the good side and not being realistic. Joffrey's not going to let her get away like that. He's going to continue his nonsense. And then he or she is forced to marry Tyrion. And I've already talked about this from Tyrion's point of view, but Sansa, again, she is someone that always expected to marry a handsome prince or a handsome knight, and to be married to probably the ugliest lord at like a decent age in the Seven Kingdoms, alongside of them, her marrying into the family that's killed her father. It's very rough for Sansa here, because all of us, the audience, know Tyrion's a pretty decent dude. Like, he's morally gray sometimes, but he's a pretty decent dude when it comes to possible candidates for Sansa to marry. But again, this is not Peter Dinklage. Peter Dinklage is I would say he's a pretty attractive dude. In the books, that's not the case. Tyrion is not attractive. He has like 2 different missing eyes. He basically doesn't have a nose. He has scars. He is not an attractive man at all. So mix that in with, again, there being a stigma. I don't know why I was struggling to say the word, against people of of short height, being kind of a dwarf. It's not a good look for Sansa. And then to have kind of a few a chapter or 2 later for her, she finds out that the rest of her family is basically dead. Robb's dead. Catelyn's dead. Sansa just doesn't really talk anymore. She becomes almost hollow, where there's no real Sansa left. And she starts to regain that as she kind of, escapes King's Landing and all that stuff with Littlefinger. She comes, she starts to get better, even though she still has another traumatic experience with Lysa and all that. But Sansa, this is definitely the worst book for her, even though she escapes King's Landing. I'm not talking about worse as in her point of view chapters. I'm talking about her as a character. She goes through a mentally draining state of events, and losing kind of everyone that's ever meant anything to her. And that's kind of how her character goes, where she goes to her lowest point in this book alongside of Tyrion. Now, I've touched briefly on Catelyn in this book, but again, her chapters are very, very interesting as always, where she's just kind of with Robb and seeing kind of what Robb's plans are and what he has planned for the war and all that stuff, and the after effects of her releasing Jaime, and just realizing kind of slowly how Robb's campaign is falling apart. And we kind of even see that Robb himself is falling apart. Robb's not eating as much. It's kind of inferred that Robb is kind of having wolf dreams, and that he's kind of coming more kind of wolfish almost, and that he's just not eating as much. He doesn't seem like he's sleeping as much, which again, think about it from Robb's point of view. I believe he is 16 at this point. Robb, it's not looking good for him. Think about how stressful it must be that you really cannot sue for peace now at this point, right? You have to either win the war or be able to hold off the Lannisters to where it's a stalemate. There's almost 0% chance Robb can win the war at this point. The Tyrells and the Lannisters have banded together, and they're at their peak power. Stannis has lost. So again, Stannis losing has ripple effects all over the kingdoms. And we see that really Robb is the only one left to fight Tywin and the Lannisters and all that. And also, alongside of that, the North has been taken by the Greyjoys. So a lot of stress going on, a 16-year-old right now. And something we see definitely with these medieval societies and stuff like that is that you are forced to grow up faster. And we see that with Robb when he comes south and he's, I believe, only 15. It's a lot. It's a lot to handle. And we see him, I think, in this book near the end of his life where he's just mentally kind of breaking. And we see that with so many characters in this book where everything that's been building up for the last 2 books is coming to a head in this book. This is why I consider this book the climax of the story, because so many massive events and so many character arcs are kind of ended here and kind of creating the new character arc for the next few books. And that's kind of how I looked at that. Now, I've talked about Jon. A lot of Jon is good in this book. I don't think this is Jon's best book. I do think all of the Wall stuff is good, and I think his relationship with Ygritte's really good, with the wildlings and all that. And I think Sam being introduced in this book, we'll talk about Sam as well while I'm talking about Jon. Jon just, again, the main part of Jon's story is, I think, the duty over honor, or over love thing, and honor and all that stuff. The majority, I think that is what Jon's plot is kind of about. At least for the first kind of, I guess, first half. And then the wall attack is really great. We see that Jon is actually injured in the books. He is a lot different than on the show, where in the show, he's kind of healthy. He's, having sword fights. He's doing his thing. In the books, he's not so good. I mean, those arrow wounds he gets from Ygritte, like, they take their toll. Like, he's really struggling physically in the books. And we kind of see him having to overcome that and kind of assume leadership, something Jon has not had up to this point, right? Very important for his character that in this book we see him take charge on the top of the wall, and we see him do all these things because, again, there's not a lot of people in charge at the wall kind of when the wildlings are attacking, right? We see that Alistair Thorne and Janos Slynt show up, like, towards the end or whatever, and it's very different the way things play out. Where in the show, Jon willingly is like, I'm going to go try and kill Mance Rayder. In the books, it's very much different. Where Janos Slynt and Alistair Thorne were basically telling Jon, go die. Go be this messenger to the Mance Rayder and go die, is basically what they were telling him. So, again, a lot of very small details but are different in Jon's story in the books. But again, Jon has a very strong arc, because that's what I'm going to say in every book. Jon, in my opinion, does not have a bad book. Jon is a very great character for the books. He really has a very interesting kind of character arc where we see him come to the end, the finishing of his character arc in this book, and then we'll have a new one in Dance, where book 1, he was a character that didn't know who he was. He didn't know what his purpose was, who he was as a person, and he by the end realizes he's a man of the Night's Watch. He's going to stick with this, and he is Jorah Mormont's squire, basically, or steward, and he's being kind of prepped for command. We've seen this with Jorah Mormont commanding him and kind of grooming him. Qhorin Halfhand gives him some great advice and kind of, again, grooming him almost to be this character that can lead, even Ned to an extent, you know, grooming him for command. And this all comes to a head when he is eventually made Lord Commander at the end of the book. Again, one of my favorite chapters is watching Sam try and get all these people to believe that Jon could be this mutual candidate that everyone can be okay with to be Lord Commander. And Sam, he's a very underrated character as well in this book. Sam, to me, his chapter of the Fist of the First Men, kind of recounting of what happened, is such a great chapter. I really love the way George kind of describes the attack and kind of what the Whites are about. And Sam, again, very kind of, I guess, standard character arc where he, you know, has to make his way back to the Wall with Gilly and then, you know, baby Sam and all that. And Sam, to me, just has a lot of solid chapters. He kills a White in this book, which is mind-boggling because, again, hadn't really seen this much. And the thing is, right, we get 2 White Walker encounters or other encounters in this book. And I think so my friend Luke, we've been rewatching I've been rewatching, he's been watching it for the first time, and he asked me a question about, you know, how many times do we actually see the Whites in the books? And I think I calculated that we see them only 5 times, I think. It's like, it's under 6. So again, we do not see them often, but we see them quite a bit in this chapter. Or not chapter, in this book. So again, Sam, really strong character, along with Jon up there in the north. Now, with my favorite characters and my favorite camp of the book, or not, maybe not the book, but my favorite camp in general is the Stannis Davos camp. And we see the after effects of Stannis losing this battle, how Stannis is starting to become kind of more desperate, that this, you know, him losing all of his ships, really, all of his men, and how broken he kind of seems as a character. It seems like he's aged years from Davos' point of view. And really, Davos and Melisandre are constantly trying to get Stannis on their side. It's very much an angel-devil situation with the two, and they tug at Stannis really the entire book. And eventually, Davos gets through to Stannis, and even Mel, to some degree, also helps with that as well, that he needs to go north. And Stannis is the savior of the Wall. Without Stannis, the wildlings would have broken the Wall. The Wall did not have enough supplies to continue being attacked every, basically, day. And the wildling plot, for the most part, is resolved. And the north plot resolved by Stannis. It's, again, a pretty good way to end, I think, his character arc for the first kind of, I won't say 3 books, because Stannis really didn't have a character arc in book 1 because he wasn't really in it. But his character arc from book 2 to book 3, where he's trying to do something for the greater good. Him protecting the North is really for the greater good. And Stannis, to me, is trying to gain favor with the North, which is kind of his way back to the throne if he can kind of get all these houses together. And also unite Westeros against the common threat of the Whites. And we'll see that, and we'll talk about that in Dance when we get to that book. But Stannis, to me, again, has a pretty strong character arc in this book. Not as big of a role as a lot of the characters, especially with other characters going on in King's Landing and North and the Wall. He definitely gets kind of put to the sideline in this book, and he's not a major character for me. But again, very strong when these characters are in the book at all. I think a character you guys have all been waiting for me to talk about, Jaime. Jaime is a character that I believe has the best character arc of the books. And this book is really about us discovering who Jaime is. Jaime is kind of finally made into a POV character. We kind of see the inside of his mind, and alongside of kind of Brienne, we also kind of see what's going on inside Jaime's head. And Jaime is someone that, after he loses his hand, becomes a different person. He starts to kind of be a better person, be a person that kind of makes up for his mistakes, and is a very morally complex character, right? Where we see him save Brienne. We see him trying to keep his oaths to Caitlyn. with giving, Brienne all of this stuff to help reclaim Arya and Sansa and all that stuff. So Jaime, to me, is a character that benefits from this book in general, from being a main character and a beloved character, where at the start of the story he was one of the most hated characters, and now to being one of the most beloved. So you see how his character arc really kind of comes together nicely in this book, and even his reveal that Tysha was not a whore is something Jaime was trying to pay back, trying to be honest, trying to make amends for the wrong things he's done in his life, and he frees his brother Tyrion. And mark that as you will as a bad or good decision from Jaime's point of view. We see his motives and see what is driving him and how he's trying to be a better person. And we'll really get into that in Feast, which I'll be doing next week. So if you guys want to see that video, I'd subscribe, see that video next week as well. But Jaime in this book is very strong. He is a major character, but when you look at some of the other things going on, he is kind of a side character that is made into a main character by the next book. So the last kind of character I want to talk about in this, video and book review of the series is that Merritt Frey, in my opinion, has one of my favorite ending chapters for the books. I do think Varys's is probably the best one. I think Kevin Lannister's in Dance is really good. I think it's probably the best one, but this is a good one. We are reintroduced into Catelyn Stark, but as Lady Stoneheart. And this chapter, I really do love everything around this chapter. I wanted to mention in this video, I don't have a lot to say about it because, again, a lot of what is going on with her is going to be put into the next two videos, but I just think it's a really great way to end out the book and all that. So, again, I hope you guys have all been enjoying this series. I've really loved talking about the books, and I go on these books for hours and hours, but I try to keep them more or less in the 25 to 40 minute versions. So let me know if you guys have other thoughts about the book that I didn't really address in this video, and if you guys like this type of content, let me know, and I'll keep doing it. We are almost done. We're about 60% of the way through. I'm really excited to talk about Feast of Crows, or Feast for Crows, next week. I just got done actually reading it, probably like 2 or 3 weeks ago from you guys watching this. I'm currently on Dance. I'm about a third of the way through on my reread. So I'm really excited to talk about Feast because I think Feast is definitely not a loved book of the series, and I'm definitely want to give it some love next week. So I will see you guys next Tuesday with the Feast for Crows book review, and I hope you guys all enjoy this video, and I'll see you guys in the next one. Bye, guys.
When you play the Game of Thrones, you
subscribe and like,
or you die. There is no middle ground.